Good evening, everyone. The first item on the agenda this evening is appointment of chairman. Councillor Band.
I'd like to propose appointing Councillor Pat Frost as chair.
Do we have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Ellis. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for that. Normally when we have a joint overview and scrutiny, the two chairs of the scrutiny committees are chairman and vice chairman. Therefore, from the chair, I would like to propose Councillor White Ramsdale. Is that agreed? Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, there are a number of you here who are not members of the joint committee. Could I ask that members of the joint committee do not sit in the back row? The reason is that way we know who's who. So, because if you're a member of the joint committee, please join us down here. That would be very helpful. Now, there is something strange about tonight's agenda, and that is that we do not have public questions or informal questions before the event. So, Sarah, I gather you wanted to ask a question. I'm sorry about that, but it's just one of those things tonight. Therefore, could I suggest that you put it in writing to the officers and they will give you a written reply? Would that be all right?
Your procedures say that you are allowed to ask them.
But it's not on tonight's agenda.
Well, sorry, why isn't it?
Because it's a special meeting of the joint two overview and scrutiny committees, and it's a one subject evening. So please do, I don't want to get into a debate with you, please do let the officers know what you want to ask, and we will ensure you get a reply. Thank you. Mr. Ellis?
Sorry to interrupt, Chairman, but it's rather warm in here. Would you mind if we gentlemen took our jackets off?
Gentlemen, take your jackets off.
Thank you.
I don't want to put the air conditioning on, because otherwise we won't hear each other. Right, thank you all very much indeed. We have what could be quite a long evening in front of us. And we're going to, first of all, have a presentation. Now, I'm not going to tell you what happens in the event of a fire. Just follow me, and we'll all vacate the building fairly quickly. But there is no planned fire escape a fire drill for tonight. What we're going to be doing this evening is looking at the first part of the local plan. And this is just going to be part of the journey. So as we go through the agenda, you will see what's going to happen. So we've done appointment of chairman. Apologies for absence. Emma?
Thank you, Chairman. We've received apologies from Councillor John Fraser, Councillor Michael Goodridge, Councillor Peter Isherwood, Denise Legow, Peter Martin, Sam Pritchard, David Round, Simon Thornton and Liz Wheatley.
Thank you very much indeed. Is there anybody else that we haven't got on the list that you know about? Okay, thank you very much indeed. Declarations of interest. Emma?
Thank you, Chairman. I've received one declaration in advance of the meeting, which is from Councillor Richard Seaborn, a non-pecuniary interest as a governor of Bramley Infant School and as a non-executive director of St Catherine's Enterprises.
Thank you. May I give you my own declaration of interest as a Surrey County Councillor? Thank you. Right, we then move into item 4. Now, we have a presentation which our officers are going to do for us. I've seen it, it's very good. What I would urge you to do, ladies and gentlemen, if you would be so kind, is if there's anything on the slide you require a point of clarification on, ask the question, but don't enter into a long diatribe about that particular item, because we are going to go through the report and that will be your opportunity to then make statements, ask questions, etc. Does that make some sense? because otherwise we won't get through the presentation, and that will be very, very useful. Now, we've had lots of presentations, we've had lots of meetings to look at where we are on the local plan, and this is now pulling it all together. This is part of a journey, and there will be an opportunity as we go through that journey to the time when it goes to the inspector for comments to be made on the final version. And it would not just be you making comments, it will be members of the public will be able to make comments as well. So if we may move on. Right, officers, I think you're starting off, Elizabeth. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Chairman. Members, just by way of introduction, I just wanted to start with a few words of context to help inform your assessment this evening. Then going to pass over to Graham Parrott, the Planning Policy Manager, who will take members through the detail of the emerging local plan. We've put this PowerPoint together to help you this evening. The Chairman felt that was a good way to bring out the issues, and I hope it will benefit your understanding of where we are with the plan, and I hope you've all got a copy of a PowerPoint that we've distributed around the room to assist you in that as well. So firstly, just to take you through to remind you of what the objectives have been for preparing this new local plan. In the first instance, you'll recall that the previous core strategy was withdrawn in 2013, and the current local plan has been based on an attempt to address the key concerns of the inspector, and we've used very much of the evidence base to progress forward and update it to actually perform the basis of the new local plan part 1. One of the key criteria for us, as you're probably aware, has been through the National Planning Policy Framework in relation to housing need, and has been a requirement for the Council to meet its objectively assessed development needs. And we've had to look very closely at this, and we'll see later on how that's meant the updating of the strategic housing market assessment in particular. We need to meet those needs in a sustainable way. They need to be addressed in a way which performs to the government's requirement to deliver sustainable development. So not only have we been looking at the amount of development required, but how it should be distributed in the most sustainable way. And a key requirement on the Council, of course, has been to meet the government's new target to produce a local plan by early 2017. That has not been particularly welcome to authorities like us who've been trying to produce a plan, but we're aware now that this particular government, with its growth agenda, is committed very strongly to having national coverage of local plans by 2017, and so our timetable is very much geared to meeting that very important deadline. And as you'll be aware, we are on track, and we've met the timescale set for us by the Council. And this important part of the process through overview and scrutiny is to get your views and steer on the emerging plan to feed into the executive. In terms of consultation, just to recap, you'll recall that in September and October 2014, we carried out a consultation with the public around 4 scenarios for growth in terms of the number and distribution of new homes. That was an extensive consultation exercise, and we analysed the comments coming out of that. And a summary of that consultation exercise is attached to your report tonight at Annex 1, page 13 of your agenda. Other issues other than housing, of course, were dealt with by that consultation in terms of greenbelt, employment land, local landscape designations, and gypsies and travellers. The scenario which proved to be that which the public supported mostly, and that has been the one taken forward, has been scenario 3, which envisages 2,600 homes at Dunsfold Aerodrome. So, members, that is a very brief summary of where we've come from. I know most members have been familiar with those headlines, but I'm now going to ask Graham to take you through what has happened going forward with the updating, firstly from the evidence base. Thank you, Chairman.
Yes, well, as Elizabeth has already said, the part of this process has been to develop the evidence base. The message is that the plan and the assessment of the plan has to be informed by the evidence. The message also is that the evidence base needs to be proportionate. And I think that's what we've endeavoured to do. I've listed there a number of the documents. Some of those you'll already be familiar with. I think the important point to make is that all of these documents together will form part of that background. So when the plan is published and put out for public comment on the plan, some of those documents that are not currently available will be available on the website, and people will obviously be able to make their assessment of the plan informed by those documents, and in fact may, as part of their assessment, choose to comment on those documents as well. I've just listed here, just briefly, the key chapters of the plan. I won't go through these in detail. Obviously, I'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a moment, but this was just setting out the overall sort of content of the plan. And perhaps the one thing I would just say at this stage in relation to that is that those familiar with what was the core strategy will know that we've had to make significant changes in some areas in relation to housing need and so on and so forth. But actually in other areas, the plan that has been produced is an evolution of the core strategy, because we don't feel there's been significant change in areas to do with some of the policies around biodiversity, for example, or design or whatever, since the core strategy was produced, which was produced after the NPPF. And so, if you like, the plan that's going forward does have its roots in that core strategy document. Just moving on to the actual content, if you like, and the policies that we have in the plan. There is an overarching policy, SP1, which will deal with the general, almost a standard policy on the presumption in favour of sustainable development. Unusually, we're often told not to repeat national policy, but ironically, when the NPPF came in, it was very evident early on that government inspectors were expecting pretty well every local plan to have some policy of this type. And in fact, the wording of this policy, I think, is wording that has been probably consistently used up and down the country in local plans. The second policy in the plan, as you'll have seen, is much more obviously focused around Waverley and the strategy for meeting Waverley's development needs. That's all set out in the document in terms of our approach to developments in terms of the settlement hierarchy, but other factors. And I think I've often said that the issues that have sort of informed the development of that strategy have partly been about the hierarchy of settlements, partly about the constraints that apply in Waverley, and partly about the availability and suitability of sites as well. Those three things all have a role to play in informing the strategy. The next plan, this is just a copy of the key diagram that sits within the document, and apologies, it is obviously quite small scale on a PowerPoint presentation, but it is just setting out and identifying some of the key characteristics of Waverley, for example, in terms of some of the major sort of constraints, and highlighting, for example, the distribution of development, some of the main changes to the Greenbelt, for example, identifying broadly where the strategic sites are located, and so on. The housing chapter obviously includes the policy about seeking to deliver, Elizabeth has already mentioned, the housing need of 519 homes a year. Over the plan period, that equates to 9,861 homes if you meet that in full. And therefore, the aim is to deliver at least that number of new homes, and then the distribution is set out in terms of the major settlements and the larger villages and the smaller villages. I think there is, and the allocation at Dunsfold, the very small villages in Waverley will continue to see a proportion of growth, but that's going to be much more based on what's happened in the past in terms of windfalls and so on. So I feel like there's a small number that covers those. These are the allocations where we think that the settlements need to have a number allocated to them. Just going on through the other chapters briefly, we again, as I said, we've sort of built on some of the work done originally for the core strategy, but the chapter on sustainable transport obviously has an overarching policy about delivering sustainable transport. It bullet points there are measures to reduce reliance on travel by car, but you'll have seen in the document the policy itself covers much more than that, but it is a general policy around transport. Similarly, we have a policy ICS1, which is about delivering infrastructure and also supporting important community facilities. The chapter on housing needs has 4 policies in there, AH1 to 4. The first one is the one that sets out the new proposed thresholds for affordable housing. Some of you will know, obviously, that recent changes in terms of government policy has meant that we can't secure contributions less than 10 units in most cases, and less than 5 in situations where it's in the AONB. But nonetheless, obviously, we ask that the policy seeks to deliver affordable housing, as it's one of the key priorities in terms of identifying housing need. We have policy AH2, which is a continuation of a policy that would support delivery of rural exception sites for affordable housing, subject to various criteria. AH3 deals with the size and type of new homes, and that part of the plan identifies some of the particular categories of housing where there is identified in our evidence documents a particular need. And AH4 identifies broadly the approach to identifying gypsy and traveller sites, although it's fair to say that this plan, Local Plan Part 1, is not proposing in itself to allocate sites at this time. I think we've explained in the document that there is a need probably for us to do further work to update the evidence based on gypsy and traveller accommodation, and if there continues to be a need to be met, that'll be dealt with through Local Plan Part 2. Just going on, employment and the economy, policies there seeking to meet the needs of the economy and protect existing employment sites where they need to be protected. A section on our town centres and shopping, so policies around development in our main centres, as well as policies for the local and neighbourhood centres and village shops. Policy on the provision of play space and safeguarding existing facilities. This will help identify what may be required in terms of play space or other facilities to support new development. For the rural environment, there are policies seeking to provide protection to non-greenbelt countryside as far as we're able to in terms of what the MPPF allows. Policy RE2 reinforcing the sort of protection of the greenbelt, but with some changes, and it is explained in there that the particular changes that are being suggested to the greenbelt in terms of some areas that are being removed, some changes to the villages and village settlement boundaries, and some changes in terms of additional land going into the green belt. Some of those detailed changes will not take place until Local Plan Part 2, but they are identified broadly as part of Local Plan Part 1. There is also policy dealing with some of our local landscape designations and how we deal with those going forward, the evidence to support them. And again, you'll see that in some cases the broad protection of those areas is identified in Local Plan Part 1, but we have identified the need perhaps to review the details of some of those boundaries as part of Local Plan Part 2. Townscape and design, an overarching policy about protecting character and amenity and requiring good quality design for new development. And again, an overarching policy, HA1, to preserve and enhance heritage assets in the borough. Natural environment, these are the biodiversity policies, so there's one there dealing generally with a whole range of different categories and types of site and designation. That's any one. There's a policy dealing particularly with green and blue infrastructure, and then a specific policy dealing with the approach in relation to developments that are within the zone of influence of the Thames Basin Heaths SPA. Climate change and flood risk management, again a range of policies there around mitigating the impacts of climate change, sustainable construction and design, renewable energy development, and finally flood risk management. And then there is the chapter on strategic sites. We've listed those sites there. Each site, as you'll have seen, has background and a proposed policy for those sites. So that they're all contained in Chapter 18 of the plan. I think many of you will have heard us say these things before, but it's worth just a timely reminder to say that what the inspector is going to be doing when the plan is actually submitted for examination is assessing whether it's a sound plan. Those are some of the tests of soundness about whether it's been positively prepared. Is it justified? And that's where the evidence comes in. Is it going to be an effective plan? Is it deliverable, if you like? And is it consistent with national policy? We have been taking advice along the way as well, where necessary, including, for example, the visit by or advisory visit by the Planning Inspectorate, This was generally giving some sort of positive feedback on the work we've done to date on the plan. Obviously, the need to progress the plan, even though we were aware that there were still some uncertainties, for example, around the improvements to the A3. We did have a discussion around issues of unmet housing needs, and that's really an issue, if you like, where we're aiming to meet our own needs, obviously, but we're within the same housing market as Guildford and Woking. There is currently, on the basis of Woking's current plan, potentially an undersupply of housing, and one of the things we will be looking to do is to agree some statement of common ground with Guildford and Woking about how that's going to be addressed in the longer term. And the final issue which was raised was the need to ensure that we have some flexibility in our plan in relation to what happens if certain sites don't come forward. And there's I think we've included that in our monitoring and implementation sort of framework as to what we would do if it appeared through our ongoing monitoring that sites weren't coming forward. Just finishing off with the next steps, as Elizabeth has said, this is part of a journey. The next step, if you like, on that route is the executive, which meets on the 12th of July. Followed by that, the intention would be that the plan would be, assuming it's been approved by executive, forwarded on to full council for final approval, and that approval would be to publish the plan. And that's the trigger, if you like, which commences a period of representations where people are able to make comments on the draft plan. What happens in that process is that those comments that are made obviously come back to Waverley for us to have a look at what is being said, but also at that stage those comments are also prepared, ready to be submitted with the plan, so that the planning inspector also has those comments when he or she comes to carry out the examination of the plan. The current intention is to, following that period for public comment on the plan, would be to submit the plan for examination later on in the year in November. And then during the course of next year, the examination would take place, and obviously, hopefully, the plan completed and ready for adoption.
Thank you very much, Mr. Parrott. Is everybody happy with that, or do you want to ask a question, point of clarification on the presentation? Thank you. Yes, Councillor Harris.
At the risk of being slightly pedantic, is there anywhere that I can source a definition of the descriptions of soundness that you've provided? So what does positively prepared mean? What are the metrics? How do I know when we've achieved it? And similarly for the others.
Mr. Parrott?
The definition, or the statement, is lifted straight from the MPPF. Obviously, the government has the MPPF as well as the National Planning Guidance, which is there to help in terms of the production of local plans. And in fact, there are various other documents. The Planning Advisory Service, for example, has a document about preparing a sound local plan. So I'm sure some of these may go into these things in a bit more detail. We've taken I'm not sure there's actually an absolute strict definition that says it's positively prepared means absolutely this, but there will be lots of evidence and documents out there, and even examples of other examinations where inspectors have expressed their views around whether something is meeting those tests of soundness.
But presumably you've considered exactly what those mean in detail in order to be able to say with any confidence that your local plan meets those requirements. So my question is, what definitions have you accessed or developed, and what metrics did you apply to make sure that we're on track and that we meet those criteria?
Well, obviously, we are familiar with and we keep an eye on what's happening all the time in terms of other plans going through the process. Of course, we had our own core strategy going through the process as well, and some of the assessment there around how we had addressed the plan. So I think we're pretty confident that, together with things like the fact that we've had the advice from the planning inspector through the advisory visit, we've had in the past critical friend advice as well. So I don't think we've had any feeling that we're vulnerable. These are matters of judgment, ultimately. They are judgments as to whether the plan is positively prepared. Is it going to be an effective plan? And is it justified by the evidence? Those will always be matters of judgment.
Contributed to the plan.
I just want to be clear as a member of the committee that I know what to look at in order to be able to scrutinise the plan as has been produced, to make sure that it is in accordance with the standards that we seek to meet. And I would expect to be able to point it to something very specific. And I'd be grateful for reference to that document or those specific documents.
Elizabeth?
Chairman, thank you. We can certainly send members a link to those relevant documents from government, the National Planning Policy Framework section on soundness and the relevant planning practice guidance, if that would help going forward. Thank you.
Not really. I'd want the definition that you have. What's your backstop when you've been going through this to assess whether the work you've done meets the 4 headings that you have offered us in the brief? What does positively prepared mean? How do we know that we've met that? And ditto for the other 3, as simple as that.
I think as we go through this evening, I've been very impressed with the plan, and I've spent a long time reading it. So the work that the officers have done, and we've had lots of evidence, both from the general public and by looking at all the documents from government, and I am convinced that we have positively prepared this plan in a positive way. So what I'd like to do now is, in fact, to go through the plan, and therefore you can all ask questions as we go through, and if there's something you don't think is positive, then say so. Okay.
It's a transparency thing, that's all. I'd like to have an easy answer to the...
Thank you very much indeed. Now, we're very fortunate that we've got here tonight the leader, and I know the leader wishes to speak. Leader, do you wish to speak now, or do you want to speak later on? I really don't mind. What we're going to be doing is taking some general comments on the start of this, and then we're going to go into the policies.
Chairman, thank you. Yes, I really want to leave this to members tonight. Obviously, as an executive, we welcome their feedback, and we've got meetings scheduled later this week to actually understand and take all of their comments on board. So I really feel tonight it's for members to speak. But just to really, if I could just reiterate very briefly, please, Chairman, we had a visit, as Mr. Parrott just mentioned a little bit earlier, from an inspector from PINS back on the 25th of May. And Councillor Edwards joined me for that meeting, along with Mr. Wenham and a number of the planning officers. And I think it's really important to stress that that inspector had sight of this draft plan. He had sight and had seen a number of the documentation and annexes that back up this draft local plan, and his feedback was extremely positive. It's very constructive. There were some areas that he flagged that he felt we needed to be aware of and we maybe needed to look at, and he gave us some suggestions. But really, to Councillor Hess's point, I was very confident and felt very confident after we had that visit that we are and have before us a very robust evidence-based plan. However, what I would also stress, and I know you stressed in your opening and officers have stressed, is that we have to remember at this stage that this is a living, breathing document, and it is going to receive input, and it will also, and there is the opportunity for us to actually, feed into that document. So what we're seeing now is still a draft document. It's pretty much there, but we must remember that as we work through over the next few months. And that really, Chairman, is all I wanted to stress tonight. As I say, we see this, I've got some executive colleagues here tonight, as the opportunity for members to actually feed back, and we look forward to hearing your feedback from this evening. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed, Leader. Mrs. Sims.
Chairman, if I could just add something just to Councillor Hess's question, which I feel perhaps he wasn't entirely happy with the answer that we gave, and I just wonder whether I could just quote to you from the National Planning Policy Framework. There's a lot more around this, which, as Graham has explained, we derive from best practice, from further government guidance, from support that we've gained from having the plan looked at, for example, by a planning inspector. But in terms of positively prepared, the NPPF says the plan should be prepared based on a strategy which seeks to meet objectively assessed development and infrastructure requirements, which we've made reference to, including unmet requirements from neighbouring authorities where it is reasonable to do so and consistent with achieving sustainable development. That's the first point. The second point is that it needs to be justified. So this is where the evidence base comes into play. The plan should be the most appropriate strategy when considered against the reasonable alternatives based on proportionate evidence. Thirdly, the plan should be effective, and that means the plan should be deliverable over its period and based on effective joint working on cross-boundary strategic priorities. So in there is all the discussions and the duty to cooperate process, etc. And then finally, the plan should be consistent with national policy, i.e. the NPPF. The plan should enable the delivery of sustainable development in accordance with the policies of the framework. So that, of course, has meant us every time we're writing a policy, is it consistent with the NPPF? Sometimes it's not always that which we feel locally might be the aspiration, but all the time we're up against this requirement to check, is it consistent with national policy? Because, of course, that, by definition, sets the framework. So I hope that gives you a little bit more beef on that. That's really what soundness is really testing. Thank you, Chairman.
Very much indeed, Mrs. Sims. Yes, Mr. Hess.
Can I thank you, Mrs. Sims, for that response? I'll make it quite plain. I'm absolutely a firm supporter of this plan. It's absolutely terrific. It's put us light years ahead of where we were. Parking that, in order to make it easy for the committee to monitor what's been done, it simply take consistency with national policy. It's nothing more sophisticated than having an assessment of what national policy we need to be consistent with, simple list, and we tick, are we consistent with those or not? It's an easy check, and it establishes that we've achieved that threshold. That's all. And I know you've done that thinking. I think we may just have or we haven't quite met each other on understanding what I'm getting to. You've done the thinking. I'm just asking, where did you express that thinking so that this committee can easily say, yep, they comply with all of those, job done. That's all.
I think the other thing that one needs to be aware of is this is almost the last in a number of briefings we've all had, and I'm sure you've attended all the briefings. And that way that a lot of people will already have an insight into what this draft plan is all about. If you feel that you need more information about links to where the officers have got their information from, then please do actually contact the officers separately and they will give you those links. I am really very content that they have done everything that they need to do to put together before us the draft plan that we are going to be commenting on tonight. It's not going to be rewritten, but we need to comment on it before it goes to the executive. I thought the briefing we had to start with, the slideshow we had to start with, in fact set us on the track again and reminded us where we have come from to where we are now. So if I may, what I'd like to do is to move on to the bulk of the report. Now, if you have no general comments on what we're looking at, I would like to go to page 39, where we are listing the strategic policies and sites. Mr. Ramsdale.
Thank you, Chairman. I did have a point I wanted to raise sooner than page 39. If we could go to page 19, which is in the consultation feedback. Just underneath the heading, locating housing on the edge of settlements, there's the paragraph there that reads, the majority of responses disagreed that there is scope to increase house building on the edge of the main settlements. By contrast, in relation to villages, the majority of respondents agreed that there is some scope to provide additional housing on the edge of villages. And then that's supported where on page 26 there's feedback that a more even distribution of housing across the borough is a scenario, and an increase of housing in the larger villages and lower tier settlements is the scenario. Now, given that was the feedback, and earlier it said to the majority of feedback and views, I don't understand why, when we then get into the discussion of the different sections, on pages 57 and 64, 57 in bullet 2 of para 3.2, we have most of the new development will be located in and around the main settlements of Farnham, Godalming, Hazelmere and Cranley. And over the page on, page 64, a few pages on, in determining, for para 5.10, the last sentence, in determining the amount of housing proposed to each settlement, account has been taken of the settlement hierarchy, i.e. push it all on the edges of the existing towns, not spread it around. Officer, I'd like some explanation as why we're not spreading it more, and I'd certainly like to have seen more spreading than the way it seems to be emphasised on the 4 towns, and then elsewhere it describes how it's emphasised on 2 of those small towns. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Parrott, could you answer that? I thought that the first part, page 19, they were the comments from the general public as a result of the consultation.
I think I said when I did the introduction that there were various factors which influenced the strategy as it emerged. You'll know as members that we consulted on the 4 scenarios in 2014, and these are the comments that Councillor Ramsey has referred to were comments made in response to some of the questions that were asked at that time, more general questions, as well as asking people to comment on the scenarios themselves. Those scenarios that we presented did identify a range of development at the Dunsfold Aerodrome, as you know, from 0 to 3,400. It then presented, linked to that, options around development within other settlements. The strategy, as I said before, has been affected by the settlement hierarchy, by the constraints that apply to the borough, and by the availability of sites. Picking up specifically on the question of the villages and the role that the villages might play, I think it's fair to say that we think in the plan the villages are playing a role where we think that is achievable. I think, you know, if you look at some of the larger villages, I'm thinking particularly, for example, of Milford and Whitley, and some of the changes proposed there in those villages, which would involve taking land out of the Greenbelt to allow some growth in those villages. In the villages that sit a tier below that in the settlement hierarchy, the ones with perhaps fewer facilities, we've had to take a view about what is appropriate. In some cases, that's been partly informed by the fact that actually there aren't that many sites that are coming forward anyway in those locations, but there are villages, and I think Orvold is a very good example of that, where we have a lot of sites that people have put forward, but we have to take a view on what's right for a village with fairly limited facilities in terms of how much you would want to seek to grow villages. And the strategy that has unfolded and that has been through and developed since that consultation and has been through as an emerging, unfolding strategy through the executive on a couple of occasions, I think, has really explained and expressed that position. And it hasn't been the case that the council has taken a view that it wants to significantly grow one or more of its smaller villages. And that's certainly a line that we as officers feel is the appropriate line to take in terms of making it proportionate. We recognise clearly that there are, in terms of the main settlements, that the settlements that are less constrained by issues such as AONB and Greenbelt are, in this plan, taking more development. And that, again, is something which we've had to think about very, very carefully. You'll all have heard the government's position on things like Greenbelt and protecting the Greenbelt and the importance of also things like national designations such as the AONB. So that's how the strategy is unfolded. And in some cases, it's not always possible to develop a strategy which picks up all the things that come through the consultation, because sometimes they end up with issues where you end up almost in a conflict. You take one approach which may support one line of argument, but actually then runs into difficulties because you're hitting up against constraints that apply in a certain area. So I think we've done our best to pull those things forward, but certainly we feel we've developed what we think is the right approach for the villages.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Parrott. What I'd like to do now, if I may, is go to page 39, and you've got there a list. And they are all the strategic policies and sites. Now, I think we need to approach tonight's meeting in hopefully a structured way. So what I'd like to do is to go down each of those, and if you've got anything you wish to say on any of those policies, we will take that policy. And if you've got nothing to say on some of the others, we will move on. Is that all right with everyone? As a structured way of doing it? Mrs. Wojciechowski, you indicated you wish to speak.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Chairman, forgive me for asking what might appear to be a very ignorant question, but before we get too deep into the report, can I ask officers for their opinion on our exit from Europe? Does this mean that it has an effect on our housing numbers?
Wojciechowski, I don't think officers will have had time to, rather like the government, to assess what the results of that are going to be. So we have this in front of us. If we can just take what we have, we may have to change it later. That's another story. But I do take your point. Is that all right?
That is. Thank you, Madam Chairman. The only reason I mentioned it is because everybody's probably thinking it, but also we know that Guildford as well have already committed to looking at the local plan as a result. So I'm just thinking about cross-work.
I think let's stick with what we know.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it. If you can get too far in and find out, look at something else.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Right, so if we're all happy with the approach, let's move on. I know one of the things that you will be very keen to talk about is the highway assessment, but that comes right at the end. And if we don't have time tonight for that, then we will reconvene this meeting specifically to talk about that. All right? Thank you. Right. Chapter 1, Introduction and Context. Anybody? Spatial portrait? Councillor Ellis.
Thank you, Chairman. I assume we're including in this the spatial strategy as well. And I looked to the chart on page 4 of Graham's presentation. It says here, maintaining Waverley's character whilst ensuring development needs are met in the sustainable manner. Now, I have to say, I do not oppose development in Cranley. I've been saying for years we need development for young people and us old wrinklies as well when we try and downsize. But I'm keen to understand what is going to be done to maintain Waverley's character, in particular Cranley's, whilst this huge influx of development takes place. Because there are things, I believe, that we treasure within our own locations which do need to be preserved. And I'd like to hear what are we going to do there.
I'll ask Mr. Parrott to answer that. But I think if you read further into the report, it does say that it's very important that we do retain the character of the areas in which we live. Mr. Parrott.
I think, Chairman, in terms of the the strategy and the numbers, if you like, and I'm thinking particularly of the Cranley situation. Obviously, we have a number of sites that have been put forward to the council for development. As I've already explained, I think it's fair to say that we face a more difficult challenge in terms of how we respond to that in areas which are not constrained by some of the national designations because of the agenda, the government agenda, obviously, to support housing growth and for us to meet our needs as far as we are possibly able to. Clearly, what we are in the process of doing is putting together, alongside the plan, an infrastructure delivery plan to identify the infrastructure that is going to be required to support development, and the infrastructure delivery plan will be available and published, obviously, alongside the plan. Obviously, we know that the issues and concerns raised around Dunsfold, and clearly there's more work to be done in terms of what might finally happen there in terms of planning applications and so on, but we are already, and the plan has identified quite a comprehensive list of infrastructure and expectations to support development on that site. I hope that the plan, as it tried to explain, as I've already said, how the strategy has emerged, why the strategy is what it is, but I don't say much more at this stage, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Adams, you've indicated you wish to speak, but you're not down to speak.
Madam Chairman, I just wish to make a comment on that question.
Okay, you may make a question.
Councillor Ellis, we have recently reviewed the Cranley Conservation Area, I think, as you know, and that has been passed through executive, and obviously that has a material impact on the design in those areas. So we are trying as best we can to ensure that the design criteria Cranley require is taken into account.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Adams. Anybody else there? Could I move on? Yes, Mrs. Cope.
I was just wondering whether we could just build on the, the golden thread that runs through the MPPF. I mean, we're relying on the MPPF to do that for us. We don't actually sort of just emphasise it, do we? That working, using that as a tool, the fact that everything has to be of top quality, good design. I mean, that is what ultimately would preserve the character of the individual settlements and villages and everything else. So, it wouldn't take much to add to the wording just to stress that Waverley is taking design very seriously. I know we have to do it with the MPPF, but it doesn't do any harm to stress it, does it?
I think, Councillor, if we look through the report, the design statements come to the fore, and talking about looking at the design statements and also neighbourhood plans. That features in the bulk of the report as well. Yes, I do agree with you. Thank you. Then in which case, if I may, yes, Councillor Ellis.
Sorry to keep banging on, Madam Chairman.
Well, I've got 19 more items to go. Go on, Councillor.
I think I've almost forgotten what I was going to say. But I think it is important. I know it's been mentioned briefly, but if you drop a large number of houses on any settlement, existing settlement, it will make a difference. It needs infrastructure. It needs the infrastructure before you start throwing the houses up and selling them. I've been castigated because I invited a meeting of the major developers in and around Cranley, and it was suggested it was a secret meeting and all this good stuff. All I was seeking to have them understand, and I'm sure Mrs. Sims will support me in this, is the need for the infrastructure before anything else. Particularly when your existing infrastructure is creaking already, whether it's sewage, water supply, electricity, or whatever. It's important that all of that is addressed first. And if I could just make one small point, Madam Chairman, and then I will wrap up. At the moment, if I look, Cranley, we're looking at 1,520 houses. If you look at the eastern villages as well, you heave that in, another 435, brings it up to 4,555. And if you compare that with Farnham, Godalming and Hazelmere, about 4,970. These are ballpark figures. We're down actually to 52% in the western part of the borough and 48% in Cranley. And I don't really want to draw back into the Brexit that Mrs. Wojciechowski indicated, but I think there's something really that I need to remember there, and perhaps the rest of us do as well. Thank you.
In your 4,300, were you including the 2,600 for Dunsfold, the new settlement? No. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Right. If we can move on, because otherwise I can't organise breakfast at this stage. Councillor Merrilies.
I just wanted to ask about the rail services, because in Farnham at the moment we are having a whole new layer of car parking put on at the railway station. When you consider we're going to have another approximately 3,000 more people there, are you consulting them? Because what we will be getting now, I think, will just about cover what we've got. So I wonder what's happening about that.
Councillor, it will be on one of the items that we're going to discuss tonight.
Oh, okay.
It's on rail services and it's page 51.
Oh, okay,
so
thanks.
We'll get there.
All right, cheers.
Thank you. Right, if I can move on. No more than that. Local plan objectives, are we happy with that? Thank you. The spatial... Yes?
Sorry, Chairman, for being late on that. I'd just like to point out that it's in this area, pages 57, 59, 64, where I think we've leapt into some inappropriate conclusions in taking all the development, or nearly all of it, to the main settlements. I personally disagree with the second local plan objective on page 59, in particular the bits where it says to contribute to the delivery of sustainable communities by directing most new development to the main settlements of Farnham, Godalming, Hazelmere and Cranley. I just think it's wrong that we're taking most to those 4 places.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor. I thought Mr Parrott had actually answered that, because it's very similar to your original question. Did you not, Mr Parrott?
I think, Chairman, I've said what I felt I was able to say in terms of explaining the rationale for why we felt that the villages could only accommodate a certain proportion of the borough's growth.
Thank you. Does anybody wish to comment on Councillor Ramsdale's? No? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Councillor. Spatial strategy, we all right there? The amount and location of housing. And that is section 6, which is on page 69. Or are we happy with the comments made by the officers? Councillor Byam?
Yes, thank you for that, Chairman. Location of housing, and Brian Ellis has talked about the problems of increasing numbers in certain areas. Cranley, of course, suffers from the fact that, unlike the other 3 main settlements, it hasn't got a boundary of another borough, another borough or another county alongside it, and therefore it's open for development all the way round, 360 degrees, where Hazelmere has got perhaps about 250 degrees or maybe even less. So that creates a bigger problem. But what also concerns me much more is the fact that in concentrating quite a considerable amount in a more remote area of the borough, like, and I'm now talking about Dunsfold as well as Cranley, that's going to increase, well, first of all, people who are looking for social housing, how they're going to travel or whatever. They won't all have cars necessarily. They will all want somewhere to live, but they won't necessarily be able to find their workplace or whatever. And I think that is going to create us some severe problems in terms of just how these people... We've had this in a very small way with Leithfield Park, where we have people moving into Leithfield Park who are on the housing register, put their name down, have neither a job nor a vehicle, and no bus services or anything else to get them to where they need to go to provide the essentials of life, including the education of their kids.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Byam. I think if you look into the report, it is addressed in the report about the need for transport in certain areas, etc. So it is in there, and we will come to the highway assessment anyway shortly.
Yes, I have the comments ready for the highway side, and there are things there which highlight very much the problems that I'm just suggesting
Mrs. Ellis,
about that area.
thank you. Mrs. Ellis and then Mrs. Wojciechowski.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Parrott said that the sites were put forward for development. I would maintain that the sites have been put forward by developers, not the people of Cranley or the people of Waverley. They've been put forward for one reason, and that is to make a profit. And I would like to ask, where is the evidence in this report that supports that this number of properties in Cranley, and if you add to those the numbers proposed for Dunsfold, that would actually impact hugely on Cranley and nowhere else in the, well, perhaps on Godalming as well, but mainly on Cranley? Where is the evidence to support the number of people who would like to live and perhaps work in Cranley, this part of the borough? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Ellis. May I take Mrs. Wojciechowski, and then Mr. Parrott, can you answer the 2 sets of questions? Mrs. Wojciechowski.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to go back to a point that the leader made at the beginning, which is when we're looking at this document, we have to be all very mindful and aware that it is a live, ongoing document. It will always be a live, ongoing document right up until Waverley never exists in the future, whatever happens. And I think it's important to remember that, because we will always be making adaptations to it, changes, alterations. So what we see before us now is very much its draft form. And taking on the point from what Councillor Ellis has just said, on page 69, 9, it says that the objectively assessed need for housing in Waverley is 519. Coming back to Councillor Hess's point earlier about evidence, will an inspector not look at that and say, where's your evidence for 48% of the housing going into the Cranley area based on an objectively assessed need for the whole of the borough? I just think it's a little bit of a bear trap there, that there is no evidence to support Cranley 48%, but there is perhaps evidence to suggest that borough-wide there is an objectively assessed need. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
I think the evidence document, obviously, that's key here is the housing market assessment. And I think one of the challenges with the housing market assessment when you're coming to look at the market needs is that they're looking at the demographics and the data for the borough and what may be required within the borough, if you like, and and the projections that they run and the data they use to base those on is a set of borough-wide data. Yes, we do have the subsections within that which look more specifically at affordable housing requirements. And I think it's fair to say that in developing the strategy, we've had to recognise that, on the one hand, the distribution of development may not be the most ideal distribution if your number one objective was to put all the housing in proportion to where all of your affordable housing need were located. Because if you were to try and do that, then clearly you would be looking to develop more houses in places like Godalming and Hazelmere, for example. You have to then try and say, well, you strike a balance, because on the other hand, you have, as I've already said, situations where the government, for example, is very keen to protect the Greenbelt. We do have the Greenbelt in the borough where it is. We have national designations such as the AONB as well, and therefore you have to try and balance those out, and there will be those issues. I mean, you know, these are likely to be questions that we will be asked by an inspector at examination, and we have to convince an inspector that, you know, there's no single right idea here. It's trying to pull together all the different strands that you have to consider in terms of sustainable development, which is the social side, which includes things like where your housing needs are located, but environmental considerations as well in terms of what's the right distribution. I'm not sure whether that's answers the question completely, but it's just trying to highlight the dilemma, if you like, in terms of what might sometimes appear to be quite sort of competing objectives.
It does, thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd say that the pit drops there are that it comes back to that evidence base, and if you look at it on paper, and somebody who doesn't know, looking at it objectively, will go, well, why are you putting 48% of the need of Waverley into a village that has no infrastructure, no railway station, unlike any of the main settlements? Also, a lot of the applications that are coming forward, they may not get planning permission, and therefore, where's our fallback position? And it's all these things that we need to be, we're playing a bit cautious, careful to the wind on this one, I think, and we need some clear indications to be able to convince an inspector that what we're doing is evidence-based, appropriate and sustainable going forward. And I'm not quite sure that we've addressed it in this particular section here with 48% going to Cranley. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. To some extent, I agree with Mary Frozeski. I mean, I think this part of the plan could be enhanced by almost a paragraph incorporating what Graham has just said, actually, because if we go back to the original SMAR, the 2013 SMAR, GS Hearn did actually look at the need distribution across the borough, and particularly the need for affordable housing, as it's required related to our various four main settlements and our rural areas. Now, I accept there's a conflict, but I do think we need to explain why we cannot meet the ideal distribution. And Graham has just expounded it, and I think those words ought to actually to be incorporated in a couple of paragraphs within this section of the report, which I think would go some way to producing the evidence which Mary's just been talking about.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor. Mr Parrott, if members are happy with that proposal, which came from Councillor Band, would you be happy to draft a section on it, or a paragraph?
I'm more than happy, Chairman, to have another look and see if members feel that we haven't explained that clearly enough yet. It would have to be something we'd have to put into the, I think, in the chapter on the spatial strategy, because that's setting out the overall approach to where development goes. But certainly we can have a look at that if members are concerned that it's not adequately explained at the moment.
Thank you. Members happy with that? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. With reference to section 615, or paragraph 615, it states rather ambitiously that we're going to deliver 3,700 new dwellings in the planned period, mostly expected to be delivered between 2016 and 2021. And I just wonder whether we're setting ourselves up to have a target in there that's a tad optimistic given the delivery rate for houses. All I'm suggesting is slightly vaguer wording about it, because having only delivered 240 houses per year on average over the last 14 years, the chances of delivery of getting 600 houses a year for the next 7 or 8 years are probably fairly remote. And so it's just a suggestion that maybe words might be a little vaguer to avoid embarrassment in the future. Thank you.
Certainly, Chairman, we can have a look at that. I think what I would say is the two key issues here that the inspector will be looking for is, first of all, does the council have a 5-year housing supply? So the inspector will be looking ahead from the point at which the plan is examined and likely to be adopted, and whether there is a strategy in place already which will deliver 5 years' worth of housing. And I think we're fairly confident with the planning permissions and other sites and some of the strategic sites that that will be the case. The second thing the inspector will be looking at is, over the whole plan period, can we deliver the total amount of development in the plan period? I think the inspector, personally, I think the inspector will perhaps be a little bit less concerned about whether they come forward in years 10 to 15 as opposed to years 5 to 10, for example. But nonetheless, I do take the point completely. I think part of the challenge here is, and we are doing more work on this, and we will be looking again at the trajectory before we finalise it to see if we can do this. But that is that the developer, we're talking to developers, we've spoken to them already and said to them, when do you think you can deliver your site? And in most cases, the developers on sites, particularly if their sites, say, below 100 or whatever, will say, we think we can deliver these sites when we get planning permission within 5 years. And there's no impediment as far as they're concerned to doing that. Now, I suspect what will happen in practice is that the market will influence that, and some developers will make a decision not to bring sites forward as quickly as others, as they would have otherwise done. What we have to be a little bit careful of is not to shoot ourselves in the foot and go too much to the other extreme and paint a picture where we don't think anything's going to happen very much in the first 5 years, and then an inspector will say, well, where's your 5-year housing supply then? It sounds like it's a bit of a game, and it's not, but clearly we have to rely on what developers tell us, and it's not within our gift to force developers to build out sites within a certain period of time. But we certainly will look at that paragraph again, and we certainly will be looking at the housing trajectory again to see if we can deal with the perception, if you like, that delivery rates in the early years are going to be very, very high, because I think we do take the point that actually it may well be that that just wouldn't happen in practice.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Parrott. I just want to stop at this moment. Councillor MacLeod, you had your name down to speak. When do you wish to speak? Because you only get one crack at this.
Probably towards the end, Madam Chairman.
That's fine. As long as I don't forget you, then we're all right. Okay, that's fine. Anybody else want to comment on that section? And then I'm going to move on, if I may, to sustainable transport. This should bring a lively debate. Any comments on the sustainable transport? That is not the same as the transport assessment or the other pieces of paper we've got on transport. Anybody on sustainable transport? Page 75. Yes, Mr. Seagrave.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to ask a question about the potential consequences for the residents of Bramley, and in particular the younger residents, of poor air quality as the result of traffic levels. This is both the levels that already exist and those that nobody denies will result from the significant increase if this plan as it stands delivers the proposed housing in Alfold, Cranley and Dunsfold. And this problem is, of course, not unique to Bramley. It should concern other colleagues. Can I ask the officers to confirm if they are aware of and understand the contents of this 2014 report by Public Health England entitled Estimating Local Mortality Burdens Associated with Particulate Air Pollution? And I'm bringing this up because it was actually brought up by Surrey officers at a local committee training session last week. According to the report, there are approximately 25,000 attributable deaths in England during 2010 as a consequence of long-term exposure to anthropogenic particulate air pollution. Particulates can originate from a variety of sources, including harmful emissions from diesel engines. The same report specifically estimates that 56 of the attributable deaths would have occurred in Waverley. By way of context, these numbers equate to roughly 13 times the numbers of people killed on the roads in the same period. Let me explain that what we're talking about here is a situation where air pollution has contributed a small amount to the death of a larger number of individuals, rather than being solely responsible for the number of deaths that I've just quoted. Okay. Not once in the local plan does the word particulate appear. Not once in the McDonald Transport Assessment does the word particulate appear. Not once in the new Strategic Highways Assessment does the word particulate, or for that matter, safety, appear. So we've got draft policy ST1 in the local plan referring to the 2008 Waverley Air Quality Action Plan, which only mentions particulates once, and that in connection with domestic bonfires. So the reason I raise this concern is that during morning and afternoon peak traffic periods, approximately 1,000 pupils are arriving or leaving Bramley Infant School on the 281 and St Catherine's Junior and Senior Schools in Station Road just off the A281. Add to this teachers and parents, many of whom walk alongside long queues of stationary or slow-moving traffic. And we have a picture of maximum exposure to vehicle emissions at the very time when these emissions are at their worst. So I'll be clear that neither I, nor it would appear Waverley, has hard data to say whether there is or there isn't a problem in Bramley. But there's a significant body of evidence to say that the risk to my residents could be high and should be properly understood before the plan is submitted, not only for the future conditions as a result of the local plan, but for things as they stand today. So I'd like the committee to receive assurance from either officers understand the issue and confirm that the local plan manages the risk, or that the risk will be investigated and the 2008 Waverley Air Quality Plan updated to mitigate it. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Parrott, can you comment on that, or Mrs. Sims?
Chairman, if I could answer that question. There are a couple of strands of thinking here. Firstly, in pure planning terms, you'll be aware, I'm sure, members in your role on planning committees, that air quality is a material planning consideration. And in any planning application that you consider, including all those sites coming forward under the local plan eventually, if air quality is a relevant consideration, you can expect it to be addressed in any submission and any mitigation required as a consequence of development, including off-site, which largely tends to be because it's associated with traffic, and it's in the hot spots of traffic generated by developments where the air quality implications generally are. So in terms of Bramley, for example, the current Dunsfold application is EIA development, and the environmental statement deals with air quality in terms of the impact of the development against air quality considerations. Now we have an air quality assessor who obviously is an environmental health member of the environmental health team that advises us in planning terms as to whether or not submissions that come in under EIA submissions are acceptable, and you'll be familiar in seeing the outcomes of those consultations in your planning reports and recommended mitigation required to actually offset any impacts. And particularly Farnham members will particularly be aware of that. That's a process that's been carrying on for a long time because of the air quality management areas. But for any new hotspots that arise, we would expect the same considerations to be taken into account and for any impacts to be adequately mitigated before planning permission is granted or implemented. In terms of the broader overview of the plan obviously is looking at impacts on the environment through the various chapters, but it would expect that those detailed impacts to be picked up through the assessment of sites through planning applications. So your question about where does it say it in the plan about air quality particulates being taken into account, I think probably the answer to that is it would come forward as part of the assessment of detailed sites through planning applications. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you. If you turn to page 79 and look at policy ST1, it says the Council will work in partnership with Surrey County Council, neighbouring authorities, transport providers and other key stakeholders to ensure that development schemes, little 7, are consistent with the objectives and actions within the Air Quality Action Plan. So whilst it does not specifically mention particulates, it does actually go back to the action plan and does ask us to ensure that developments are in line. And that is what Mrs. Sims has just said. You wish to come back?
If I may, thank you, Chairman.
Yeah, sure.
The point I'm making is that I've just waved around a 2014 report which postdates the current Waverley Air Quality Action Plan by 6 years. So things have moved on, and my concern here is that one of our key pieces of evidence is not current in relation to a fairly serious piece of work issued by Public Health England, a government body.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Sims?
Chairman, perhaps I could suggest if you could forward that to us, we can have a closer look at it and come back to you offline as to how the findings of that study align with the Air Quality Management Plan, Action Plan, and perhaps we'll be able to bring the conclusions up to date in line with the considerations from the document that you've got. Thank you, Chairman.
Wojciechowski?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. It's just an observation, really. We have two documents in front of us this evening. We have the transport assessment and we have the strategic highway assessment report. It's an observation, really, from just a member's point of view as to how we are to digest and dissect and look at this information in layman's terms. It's very technically orientated, and I find it personally very challenging to actually make sense of it. What is interesting, I'm just wondering if there's a way of breaking it down to sort of make more sense to anybody who hasn't got the time or the mindset to actually understand it in its technical merit. Interestingly enough, in the Mott MacDonald report, Cranley's been described as having only 1.1% take the bus. But the bus is its main form of transport in Cranley because we don't have a railway station or anything of that nature, and the road infrastructure is very, very poor. It also describes Cranley as a town, so I'm just wondering when they've investigated these areas as to how much depth they've understood about the sustainability of our infrastructure in terms of transport. And I would just like to be able to see a clearer understanding from the people we're going to take guidance and advice from as to how we implement it. But as I say, it's a very technically challenging item that I think any of us here would struggle unless we're looking at it full time and understanding the technical merit behind it. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Have a comment from the officers on that. Sorry about that.
Chairman, what I would say in relation to that, we agree that they are by definition technical pieces of work which are informing the local plan. I suppose what I would say it's the timing hasn't been particularly ideal for you or for us. As you know, that the local plan timetable was changed to accommodate the submission of particularly the strategic transport assessment to make sure we had it in advance of publishing the plan. But we've only recently received it, and the reason it hasn't been made public before now is that we've been having conversations at officer level with the county to understand it ourselves and to clarify certain aspects of it. Probably in an ideal world, if we'd had a little bit more time, we perhaps would have published a synopsis or even done a technical briefing for members to bring out the salient points. But the honest answer to that, there hasn't been time in the timetable to do that, and for that I apologise. However, what is very helpful about the transport assessment particularly, I know we're not quite onto that point, Chairman, but if you can indulge me on this, there is a very helpful summary at the end, the conclusion, which we've worked hard with the county to actually have included, because originally we didn't really have even that clarity. It doesn't take away from the conclusions and the credibility of the conclusions. It's just, I agree with you, it wasn't particularly user-friendly for lay people to understand what it was actually concluding. So particularly Graham has worked very hard with the county to actually draw out what is actually being said by this. And it's that conclusion, which I haven't got it to hand, but it's on the last page of it, which actually summarise really what I would urge members to take away from this document. And in particular, what it's actually saying is, having regard to the broad overview, the strategic level that it has assessed our proposed local plan upon, that there is no envisaged severe impact in terms of the paragraph in the NPPF, which sets the test, paragraph 32, albeit it does envisage that further mitigation is required to offset the impact. So this defines the impact, and the work going forward in combination with work that's already been carried out by Mott MacDonald and with the county on the local transport plan needs to be enhanced with further mitigation. But the headline from the transport assessment is that there are no showstoppers. In fact, the level of growth can be accommodated in the borough, subject to mitigation. I don't really want to add to that, Graham, at all. Indeed.
I'm sorry, Mr. Adams, but you know, we do have rules. Are you going to comment throughout the report?
Only when the question arises, but I feel like...
If you can give us a quick comment, but if in future you could remember to let the officers know you wish to speak.
Yes, Madam Chairman. I did, as previously portfolio health for the environment, there are, of course, the two air quality areas that you know about, one at the old Deer Junction in Farnham and the one in Holloway in Godalming. But there are 50 or so other detectors scattered around the whole of Waverley, which are checked every 3 months. Now, I don't happen to know whether there is one in Bramley High Street, but that could be, you could ask the Environment Department here and they'll tell you straight away.
Thank you very much indeed. Right, then if we could move on. We've done sustainable... Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Ellis. I didn't see you.
Sorry, Chairman. To
it's all right.
Butt in again. But I wonder, looking at the sustainable transport, bearing in mind that it's already been mentioned that Cranley and Eastern villages will probably end up taking somewhere around 48% of the new build over the next 20 years or so. It's also been mentioned that we are in an area there with no railway station. The only real road is the A281, which rushes between Horsham and the Bramley roundabout. I wonder whether or not it might be worthwhile the officers explaining within their report, explaining a little further that they have actually risen to the challenge of what Cranley and Eastern villages offer here. But because with a number of houses, there will be a large number of commuters. My guess is what they will want, if they can't get on the bus, and the 53 is still running, they will get in their car and head also for the Bramley roundabout as well. But they'll probably do so on 3 exit roads from Cranley, one of which has a single-track bridge, 2 others have single-track bridges, and perhaps officers might explain that they know about this problem and that they will be seeking the appropriate infrastructure contributions towards resolving that in order to improve traffic flow for all these additional commuters.
Again, Mr. Ellis, if you read through the report, it talks about SIL, which will, once the local plan is identified and accepted, that will come into being and that will pay for the infrastructure that we need. Section 106s are going to be grouped together in certain areas to enable bigger things to take place. And I think Cranley is one of those areas where they're grouping Section 106 contributions together to actually pay for some of the infrastructure. But infrastructure, we're going to come on to in a moment, is certainly something we need to address.
Thank you for that, Chairman. I am aware, of course, that we can pull together at least 5 of the Section 106 or so. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. In which case, may I move on then to infrastructure and community services? Do we have any comments on that?
Just going back to my original question about car parking at the railways, have you spoken to what would be happening about that with the increased amount of people, particularly in Farnham?
as part of the work we've done with all the infrastructure providers, we have been talking to the rail companies about their requirements, and at this point in time we were aware of some of the plans to try and enhance rail car parking, but we've not had any other sort of major sort of issues raised in terms of a fundamental concern about what's being put forward in the strategy. And that's been the thing we've had to look at with all the infrastructure providers, is are there, I know it's a term that's regularly used, but are there showstoppers, if you like, issues which would lead us to feel that there are problems that cannot be reconciled and that are so significant that they would merit putting weight to those above any other sort of consideration. And certainly in terms of the rail infrastructure and the discussions we've had so far with rail operators, Network Rail, we've not had any indication of a major issue, no.
Thank you very much. And Councillor Merrill, if it's any help, the additional car parking they are currently building at Farnham Station, the foundations are sufficient to put 2 more decks on if it is necessary in the future. Thank you. Councillor Seaborn.
Thank you, Chairman. There's a recurring theme to the thoughts that I have when I ask questions as we're going through, and that's a lot of it where we're being asked to accept that infrastructure providers have an obligation to deliver and will deliver for new development, and yet we're actually in quite a few states where they're not already doing it, and we have an outstanding problem that could do with being solved before we move forward. So in chapter 8, paragraph 8.3, bullet 3, ambulance services come up, bullet 5, ambulance services come up. And if you track back through the evidence, 2014 infrastructure update says that the impact of local housing growth is likely to have little impact on the provision of ambulance services, and that follows on from the 2012 infrastructure delivery plan, which said more or less the same thing. And yet South East ambulances are not meeting their national targets for responses to emergencies in Waverley, and it worries me very much that the plan's not confronting that problem. And well, again, it's an issue of we're not confronting the problem, and I would like to see the problem confronted. I don't know what the solution is, but the fact is that South East ambulances are not meeting their targets, therefore our residents are under a risk that they shouldn't be under, and this plan's not addressing it. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. Perhaps I've missed something in all these documents, but I mean, continuously they refer to the infrastructure delivery plan, and it's clearly such a crucial document in relation to particularly the housing distribution which is now being put forward. Have we got an updated version of this which we can scrutinise? Because it seems to me, many of the concerns that we're expressing relate directly to investment in infrastructure and the mitigation which they hopefully will provide, that investment will hopefully provide. So that seems to me an absolute crucial document we need to be able to scrutinise in its current form.
Thank you. Can I go to the officers now? Councillor Hill, I'll come back to you. Did you
You answered.
All right, thank you. Do you want to think about it and I'll come back?
Well, I think there's two things. Sorry, Chairman. In relation to the first question about South East Ambulance, we obviously have been in dialogue with all the infrastructure providers, but I mean, I think more than happy if members feel they would like us to ask that very specific question in the light of their current failings, if you like, in meeting their targets, whether they want to offer any more comment on our plan in the light of that current situation. And I think we're more than happy to make a very particular point of going back to them on that, if members would like us to. We have pulled together an updated schedule of the comments we've had so far from infrastructure providers. We are pulling the infrastructure delivery plan together as we speak. It is to some extent a living document, and even when the plan is published, it will probably still be a draft document, but we are pulling that together. But we do have an up-to-date schedule, which I think there's no reason why we couldn't share that with members in terms of what we have currently, if you like, in terms of the responses we've had from infrastructure providers, because we asked them very specifically, what are your comments on infrastructure in relation to a particular scenario for development and distribution of development. So they've had all the information they need. Some of them are quicker at coming back than others, and that's a problem throughout the country. We try our utmost with some of them, and some of them are rather reluctant to make much of a comment, but we can certainly share the details of what we've had to date from infrastructure providers.
Chairman, only to add to that broadly, the headline is there's not I don't think any single provider that's come back to indicate that in terms of the growth that we're proposing, that they wouldn't be capable of providing the adequate infrastructure to meet the growth that's proposed. So the schedule that you will receive back will have the responses from those providers, and you will see from that as you work down it, that there are some areas of concern that we need to clarify, and we need to go back, and in fact those questions have been coming through the process. For example, as we've been talking to the planning SIG, and we are clarifying some of those comments. But generally speaking, to give you comfort, the general message is, as perhaps you might expect, they have a duty to provide these services. We're alerting them to the amount of growth proposed, and generally speaking, they're indicating that in the plan period they should be able to support that. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. I think South East Ambulance has its own problems. And what we're trying to do is to equate what is happening now with what's going to happen to a future plan. And we can only hope that when we ask the question that we're getting the answer, which is the truth. And that's really where we're coming from here. Councillor Wojciechowski.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think it's important for all of us to understand that infrastructure contributions are dependent on schemes being delivered. And it comes back to the point that Graham raised earlier, is we have no control over that. But we need to make sure that if we're going to get contributions, schemes have to be delivered, so we have to have penalties or some sort of policies that ensure that that takes place. I would also like to see that on page 81 we talk about utility services, and I'm just wondering if we're considering going forward in the planning process if utility companies can be statutory consultees, so we can have views from them as to whether schemes are appropriate or inappropriate, because they may not be able to deliver because the infrastructure from say Thames Water isn't available. Thank you, Chairman.
Chairman, I need to respond to that. Certainly the water companies are statutory consultees on planning applications, so that is already a requirement on them to respond when we do consult them, Chairman.
I have to say, officers, I'm very concerned about Thames Water because in Farnham, the Thames Water facility cannot cope. And that's before we have an extra 2,500 houses. So we really do have to do something there. I had one more. Councillor Byam.
Yes, it's on that subject, Madam Chairman. Clearly, people like Thames Water, of course, yes, they could do it if they had the will and if they had the money or whatever, and they don't appear to have either at the moment to do these things, and I've got a problem within Bramley, which is in real terms is quite minor, but nevertheless quite detrimental to the amenity of the local neighbours who happen to be tenants of ours, and they don't know where they're going to go. They're not quite clear how they're going to achieve what they need to achieve in doing so. But the other one that I've banged on about in the past in a different forum is things like broadband and communication. And I don't think we're in this Surrey we're achieving what we ought to be achieving in terms of internet speeds and the way that we provide the service, and that is not part of the question that we have in our planning applications.
I think you're right that perhaps we ought to be asking that sort of question. Surrey, as you know, has been working with broadband to try and get 100% coverage within Waverley on broadband and high speeds. That is not achievable in the more remote areas without putting out masts. And that then brings the pains on because people don't want a mast up. So it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But the government have made a commitment that they are going to do something about the broadband speeds. So we just have to hope. But I agree with you, we do need to do something. Anybody else? Have I missed anyone? No? Thank you. Then can we move on to affordable housing and other housing needs? And that is page something. '87. Sorry, I've lost my place for a minute. 87. Right. Over to you, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, Councillor Holder.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm slightly dismayed to see on page 95, paragraph 9.34, that 1 out of every 5 households in West Surrey contains a person with disability benefits. I'm just wondering whether when we instruct affordable houses to be built by the housing associations, whether we are in fact requiring 1 in 5 to be suitable for somebody with a wheelchair or things like that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a very good point, but I think you can take comfort in that the building regulations do require access for people with disabilities as part of the assessment of internal space. And as a planning requirement in terms of external assessment, we would generally require, for example, looking at shop fronts to ensure there's sufficient access for the movement of wheelchairs into a shop. So it tends to get picked up at 2 angles, internally and externally, but it certainly is a routine part of the planning application assessment process. As you say, it's a very important point to ensure that we're allowing access for people with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's a bit more to it than that, and it's where, looking at planning applications, where you make sure that the sockets are at a height that if you're sitting in a wheelchair, you can actually plug something into and not at floor level. So it's all sorts of things. But thank you. Anybody else? All right. Mrs. Wojciechowski.
Well, thank you for your indulgence, Madam Chairman. If I was an inspector and I was looking at the affordable threshold of 40%, I would be asking myself how we could secure 40% for those people who actually need it. Because when we look at affordability, it's very much at the discretion of what individuals can afford. And it worries me slightly that the very thing that we're trying to provide could be taken away, because even though there's 40% affordable and say only half of 20% can actually afford them, where's the other 20% going to go? Will they be bought up by other social landlords, non-social landlords, private investors, who then may feed the market again by using those cheaper properties to rent out? So by not having a policy or protection to prevent the very problem that we're trying to dismiss, are we opening ourselves up to another crisis in the affordable housing element by maybe some of that affordable housing going to others who then sell it, rent it out, buy it and then sell it out to those who can't afford it? Just wondering, it's a $1 million question, but it does worry me that 40% of the housing, a percentage of that could be lost to other people who then rent it out. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Wojciechowski. I don't think we can say houses go on the market, people come off our housing list and go in there. I want to see more housing for people who work in the area, and that's something which I don't think is mentioned here, and I certainly think we should mention it, because that is an area where we are got a problem. And shared ownership, I think we need to see more of that to enable, because some people can get on the housing ladder if they're in a shared ownership scheme, but they can't if they're not. So it's those sorts of things. But if people buy a house, we can't determine who that person is. Yes, please, come back.
I completely agree, Madam Chairman. I think it's a very difficult, but I think going forward, I would like to see Waverley Borough Council be creative and have a vision as to how in our policies we can create some level of protection, because otherwise the problem is just going to escalate, and in the years to come we're still going to be in the same position, because there'll be properties out there that people can't afford, because those who can then go on to rent them out. But you're absolutely right. I think where our greatest housing need is social housing, and we don't seem to be able or in a position to provide that as a social landlord, whereas again this is very much the developer-led programme that I'd like to see Waverley be creative and put some sort of benchmark in to give us some governance.
It's a very valid point, but I'm not sure it has a place in the local plan. Sorry, but I think we need to address it in another way. Thank you. Mr. Ramsdale.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to ask about the bottom of page 90, where we talked about the specific policy, where it describes how for developments under the 11, and I guess that means the 11 or 6, then it'll be a financial provision. and wondered if you'd explore just how that might be done. I thought we were going away from sort of a tariff-based culture of it's so many pounds because you've got so many bedrooms or a certain square footage.
Yes.
I think this is just a reflection of the government's advice. Our preference would be that wherever there's a requirement for affordable housing, we'd rather it was provided on site. But the government made it clear that in those exceptional circumstances where you drop below the 11 threshold, and that applies in some of our rural areas, you then have to secure that contribution as a contribution towards affordable housing generally. Now, we've done this before on other sites. We do, and there is a mechanism, a process whereby our officers can deal with applicants and identify what that contribution should be. Like, clearly, the requirement then is to have somewhere where you can then spend the money to deliver the affordable housing. So it wouldn't be our preferred way of dealing with it, but we've just had to reflect what the government policy is telling us at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have done this before. We used to call it commuted sum, where we didn't have it on site, but they paid us money, and we put the affordable housing elsewhere. So it's not a new thing for us. Councillor Band.
Yeah, I was going to say just exactly what you have said. The other thing, in rural areas, we have got to recognise that most developments will be much smaller than 11 or 6, even 6 houses. Very often, to actually secure affordable housing in rural areas, you're talking about 2 or 4 houses together. And we do need to find some way of actually funding those. And you know, that's not given any consideration in here at all. But that's the reality of actually in the villages finding, you know, infill sites to build a limited number of affordable houses.
Have we finished that section? Can I move on? Oh, yes, Mr. Seaborn.
Thanks, Chairman. Just a small point. In terms of clarity of the report, paragraph 9.30 refers to the housing needs of older people. Can't find anywhere where older people are actually defined. It's sort of implicit that they're the over 65s, but that doesn't actually match the NPPF definition where older people is a defined term. So for the sake of clarity, so that, thank you. Well, there you go. You say we don't know, so it needs definition. Thank you.
Anybody else? Thank you. Then let's move on to employment and the economy, which is page 101. Mr. Byam.
I didn't actually put my hand up to speak on the last thing, and this fits in with it in the sense that are the people on our housing needs register actually, do we know where they are in general terms, what region within part of the borough, and where they might be working, and therefore how we provide it. I know it's going to be very difficult to actually slot that together, but it's no good providing affordable housing in Cranley if the person to somebody who wants to work in Farnham but has nowhere to go there. So it's understanding the employment and the economy together with our housing needs, and I don't know how we put those together. That's a job for the officers because they're clever at these things, aren't they?
We do know where people are based and what their needs are who are on the housing register.
I think all I would say is, I mean, certainly the colleagues who work with us on planning applications consider the evidence we've got, for example, in the housing market assessment, broadly about where affordable needs in, but clearly they also refer to the council's housing needs register in terms of identifying where those needs are. Clearly, the situation that you get is that some people may, of course, register and say they're in need and would like accommodation in a number of different locations. So it's not always that clear, black and white, if you like. But certainly, though, that source of information is yet there and is used by officers in assessing the affordable housing requirements on individual sites.
Thank you. Can I now move on to town centres and shopping?
So this is just a minor point of, well, it might be a minor point, it depends what the officers tell us, but just one of my understanding of the English on policy TD1, bullet part 3. It says the preparation of local town and village design statements and neighbourhood plans will be encouraged and supported. And I'm just questioning whether the support is for the preparation or for the plan. In which case, that's not what it says, I don't think. It implies the preparation. Probably just needs a comma or something.
I think the intention there is to support those who want to develop their own town and neighbourhood plans, and we can't obviously comment on much beyond that and without seeing the plan, but you know, clearly we want to encourage those to do it. So we'll have a look at the way we phrase that if members feel it's not quite so clear. But I think that's the intention initially, was to support that. But clearly once somebody's doing a neighbourhood plan, we want to make sure then, as far as we're able to, that we work with them to deliver a plan that meets their aspirations and obviously is also consistent with the local plan and the one that we can obviously support.
Well, but based on what Mr. Parrott said, then the wording is accurate. It's just I would have thought we'd rather be rather more keen to support the delivery of the plan rather than just the preparation. But
we can have another look at the wording, Chairman, if members feel that they'd like just to strengthen that.
It's a bit woolly. Perhaps you could have.
Yes, we can do that.
Thank you.
Just reminds me that I ought to be bringing an heritage asset that's stuck in the middle of the countryside, close to the road towards Dunsfold, and it's lost behind trees and everything. It's a horse trough. A horse trough, a Victorian horse trough, which is lost to the world, and I believe is in Bramley Parish. Just.
Thank you. It says on page 166 that Farnham Park would be sufficient to provide mitigation now for at least 75% of Farnham area's net housing requirements, and depending on how average occupancy rates of new dwellings vary, there may be sufficient capacity to accommodate the entire housing requirement. First of all, we have still had no hard and fast evidence suggest that the provision of SANG actually works. I wanted to know when you suppose we will get that evidence. And by relying on Farnham Park, you're putting all your eggs in one basket as far as SANG is concerned. There again, it turns out that if it turns out that the provision of SANG is not having its desired effect, what then? What is your backup plan? I presume you have one.
Sis?
Well, Chairman, I think that the answer to the first question, we've given members in various forums on a number of occasions that we're satisfied that from the support of Natural England that the avoidance strategy is a sound document and it's legally based and it is effective, and we haven't had any evidence to the contrary that it isn't working. And in which case, as far as we're concerned, that is a sound basis for your plan going forward. In terms of SANG providing sufficient support for the growth in the plan, that's the statement we're making currently. There's no reason to suggest that we would need to find alternative SANG, and the statements that we've made are put there to satisfy you that the growth in Farnham can be adequately mitigated. So I don't really understand entirely what the concern is, what the need for Plan B is, because if Natural England are satisfied that SANG works currently, you'll be aware that in tandem to the local plan taking its course, that the full council and executive before that will consider the revised avoidance strategy in the next few weeks, and that will provide sufficient capacity to mop up the growth in Farnham as set out in the plan. So that is the statement we're making, and as far as we're concerned, it is a sound basis to support the growth in Farnham.
I think, Chairman, all I was going to say was that in addition to that, if we find we do need additional SANG capacity later on in the plan period, then we know that there are a number of developers who are looking at providing their own SANG, and I quite expect some of that will actually come forward as bespoke SANG. And we've also got opportunities and options that we've explored for longer term opportunities for SANG if we feel that we are looking at a situation where potentially we might run out of SANG at Farnham Park. And the numbers all, in terms of Farnham, are around occupancy rates and so on. So it's not as clear cut as that. We'll continue to monitor it. But in terms of alternative SANG, we are mindful of what the opportunities are, and we're fairly confident, I think, that we will be able to persuade an inspector that that approach that we've put forward is a sound one.
Thank you very much indeed. Anybody else? Mr. Byam.
I think I have to go back to the original first question that we ever had from Mary Borowski about the Brexit. Is the SANG requirement something that is an EC directive, or is it something that we've concocted ourselves? And if so, is it something that's likely to be ditched? And when he mentioned the fact of eggs in one basket, I smiled wryly and thought, the eggs are supposed to be somewhere else in another basket and not on Farnham Park. But a serious question is it something that we will be required, do we consider that we'll be required to continue with in the future when we leave the EEC?
To Mrs. Forochewski was, we don't know what is going to happen. It's an EU directive, and I don't really want to go down the what-if route. Mrs. Coburn.
Very briefly, it's actually UK law now. It wasn't a directive, it's UK law. And believe you me, when they start looking at all the laws, they're not going to start with that one.
Thank you, Chairman. I think most of us from the eastern end of the borough, have always concerned about Dunsfold as a strategic site, but reluctantly acknowledged that it's in the plan. And I think there are some inconsistencies in the way which some of the wording has been used in the protection of the conditions surrounding the acceptability of that site. If we go back to page 9 and the top paragraph, about 2/3 the way down, there's quite a powerful statement, and I quote, "The inclusion of the site as a major allocation in the plan is still subject to the provision of appropriate infrastructure to mitigate the impact of the development, particularly improvements to the road network." Now, that's a powerful statement, and I think it's a good basis for the plan. Reluctantly, we need to have it, but there's the protection. When you go to paragraph 1815 and 1816 on page 187, we're already saying it's blown away because the bottom sentence of 1815, the council considers that subject to satisfactory mitigation, the benefits to redevelopment would outweigh that. That's okay, perhaps. But then going 1816, we seem to say we've already done the testing and have agreed it's all okay. Now, I don't think we're at that stage yet. And I think there's a fair amount of controversy about the traffic plans and their implications and their deliverability. And so I would caution going as far as that at this point of the draft. I much prefer the words which were on page 9 to be left into this particular part of the document, because it does actually then recognise there is more work to be done in getting the assurance that proper and appropriate mitigation can actually be provided. And it's subject to that happening that Dunsfold development goes forward. So that's what I would like to see in exchange of what is there at the moment.
Barrett, are you happy to make sure that the comments in 9 and the comments in the next bit we've been looking at are actually similar?
Certainly, Chairman, we'll have another look at that in terms of if there are inconsistencies. We pick up the point the Councillor Bounder said, and if it's the wish of the committee that you'd like us to go away and have a look at that, particularly with the references in the earlier part of the plan and bring those two together, and then we can certainly have a look at that, and that will then feed into what goes forward to the executive.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm actually pleased to see Dunsfold Park included in this local plan. We've always argued that it is the biggest brownfield site and is deliverable and so forth. So I'm pleased I take on board some of the comments that have been said about the transport and the infrastructure, and they apply to a vast majority of the strategic sites that we're looking at here. You know, I wouldn't be doing the people of Cranley justice if I didn't ask a question tonight with regards to some of the sites that have been put forward here as to how they came about. In terms of consultation, how were these sites identified in this local plan as being strategic sites that came forward? Because there was no consultation with the parish council. There was no consultation, I don't believe, with individual councillors. So it just surprises me that, and the Horsham Road one, again, it just surprises me that there's a phase 2 being considered when phase 1 have already got planning permission and will continue to increase the numbers and push the numbers up even further. I'm just a little intrigued what criteria, and again, I look at it from an inspector's point of view as to how these sites manage to get on there, knowing that they might not be deliverable, they don't have infrastructure, they don't have the support of Thames Water. It's in the most unsustainable part of the village, and yet there's more and more strategic sites here that was not in any consultation with, from the best of my knowledge, with the parish council and fellow members. And I just wondered how they ever got to this. I know the developers probably put them forward, but how were they chosen over other sites that possibly were available? Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Can the officers answer that?
I think there's a couple of things just to say in response to that. First of all, when we did the consultation in 2014, we obviously had as part of the evidence, and we made it clear as part of the evidence, that there was a strategic housing and availability assessment with an assessment at that stage of the potential suitability of sites that were coming forward. And I think it's fair to say I'm pretty sure that all the sites, but I need to double check to be absolutely certain that are being considered were already, if you like, ones that have been promoted and put forward to us in some way, shape or form at that time. And some of you will remember, obviously, the land availability assessment, which had sites which had a sort of a traffic light sort of notation attached to them. And we also said in the consultation that we would identify strategic sites in the plan, and that the threshold we identified for strategic sites was 100. And that's what we've followed through, if you like, now and taking it to the next level, both in terms of keep reviewing those sites and the suitability of those sites, and where those sites are considered to be potentially suitable and above that threshold, we've obviously had to think very carefully about including them then as strategic allocations.
Thank you very much indeed. Is that okay? Yeah, thank you. Anybody else? Councillor Ellis.
Thank you, Chairman. Whilst I don't have a problem, I guess, with the addition of Dunsfold Aerodrome as a strategic site, I wonder if somewhere within this the point could be made that it will have major impact on Cranley, and a bus service to bring shoppers in from Dunsfold Park to Cranley doesn't actually solve those problems. But I wonder whether or not some of those problems might at least be indicated that they will be addressed before Dunsfold Park proceeds. Thank you.
I'm not sure whether that's something to go into the plan, but when the planning application comes before us, that is something we should insist on the planning application.
Thank you, Chairman. I would agree, but as long as it figures somewhere. Thank you.
Councillor Byam?
Thank you, Chairman. I was just thinking about that, and thinking about phasing, the questions about Dunsfold. I have concerns, a number of us have expressed concerns. I don't agree that it's one that I would want on the list, but it is on the list, and therefore we've got to live with it. But should we be... How do we phase the potential developments, the major developments that are going to go in any part of the borough, such that we don't have a rush at the very beginning, and equally that we have the opportunity to gather enough improvements to our infrastructure to actually be able to sustain those sites that come in?
Not sure, Councillor Byam, that is a matter for the local plan. But it is certainly, for example, if we look at the eco-town at Borden, where there's 2,000 houses, everybody assumed that tomorrow 2,000 houses were going to be built. But in actual fact, it's a phased programme over 20 years. So I think it's something which, when the applications come before us, I think we can ask the question. You know, if there's 500 houses, they're not going to be built immediately. They are going to be phased to take account of the infrastructure and everything that's there. Do the officers have a comment on that?
I think the one thing I would say is obviously within this plan itself, it's the strategic allocations that are the ones that you would be putting into the plan, if you like. So the particular comment about infrastructure is particularly pertinent, I would say, to those allocations, because the other numbers, if you like, are made up from sites that may or may not come forward, and some of them may be sites that we picked up through things like neighbourhood plans. But in terms of the infrastructure, we have done and continue to look very closely excuse me, at the infrastructure evidence we have from the infrastructure providers to ask ourselves that very question. If site A or site B is to come forward, is there any reason why it can't come forward now, or is there a particular piece of infrastructure which might limit it in terms of when it comes forward? Picking up Dunsfold in particular, you know, clearly we've identified through the plan, as far as we can do, some of the areas of infrastructure that need to be addressed, but clearly not in the level of detail that you'd expect to be picked up through a planning application. And any decision to permit development on that site through a planning application, I'm sure will need to have, amongst many other things, something which deals with the phasing of development linked to the delivery of infrastructure.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Before I say anything more, I'd like to reiterate my absolute support for the plan, and I fully recognise the hard work that has gone in here. Right. Having said that, I'd also like to say that I have some experience with government planning and government procedures and norms, and with that, or bringing that perspective to bear, I don't fully comprehend some of the language, use of language, structure of the plan. Now, if we look at the statement that the objective of this part of the plan is to explain the process going forward, there are certain things that I would, in my own limited sphere, expect to find. If my limited sphere is too limited and I've missed the point, or if there is best practice that I'm not aware of that has been followed, I'd be grateful for elucidation. But if we are to understand how this plan is going to be developed and be taken forward, should I be looking, or should I not be looking at the benefits plan, the benefits realization plan, to make sure those benefits that this describes are going to be delivered, the risk management plan, quality management plan, key aspects of what I'm accustomed to finding in any sort of high-level plan such as this purports to be. Could I ask if that can be found elsewhere?
Please. Comment from the officers?
I think one of the things where we've tried to capture some of the points that Councillor Hess has referred to would be in the monitoring and implementation part of the plan, where we will set out some of the indicators that you would use to assess the success or otherwise of the policies. And I think it's probably fair to say there's a little bit more work to be done just to sort of neaten those up a little bit. But you've got in front of you the draft of those, and we will clearly need to think about how we express to an inspector some of the contingencies and fallbacks and so on. The way this often happens in practice, I have to say, is that once the plan goes through the next stage of inviting comments on the plan, and even once the plan has got in front of the inspector, there may be a lot of toing and froing and clarification that is required to explain things to the inspector if he or she has questions and so on. So this isn't necessarily the final thing. One of the things we'll be pulling together to submit with the plan will be a little bit more detail around housing implementation, for example, and perhaps expanding a little bit on how you deal with contingencies if sites don't come forward, and from a technical point of view, and try and head off some of those questions. But there isn't, and I refer back again to our conversation with the planning inspector, there isn't, if you like, a specific shopping list of absolute musts that you include. What we do have to include are things like a habitats regulations assessment to see how it fits with the habitats regulations, a sustainability appraisal about how it fits with various sustainability objectives, a consultation statement about who we've consulted and how they've been informed and how they've influenced the plan, a duty to cooperate statement about how we've cooperated with others to meet the duty to cooperate, an equalities impact assessment will have to be included as well, and potentially at some stages, particularly if they're asked for, more information or topic papers to expand on things if we need to give a bit more explanation for things. So there's a lot of other stuff that will go with this. But I think in the plan itself, the key part to pick up the points that Councillor Hess has raised, I think, is going to be around the monitoring and implementation. And if members have a concern that that isn't giving sufficient information, then obviously we can have a further look at it. But we've worked on that quite carefully.
Thank you, Chairman. I was just going to come back to the issue you were talking about in planning terms of ensuring that infrastructure was available. I mean, clearly some of the infrastructure that affects some of these issues is, particularly, again, the Dunsfold site, are outside our borough boundary. And may well be of issues of strategic infrastructure. I'm talking about the Guildford gyratory system and things like this, which we will have little influence over. We can observe from afar, but they really will have a major impact on the feasibility of mitigation measures closer to home. So I think we do need to, in the plan, express concern or a positive note, based on the strategic infrastructure being reviewed are taken forward. I think that needs to be clearer than I have found so far.
Thank you very much, Councillor. I think it's in here somewhere. I read about the A3 slip road off the A31 and the need for that to be improved and these sorts of things. Because what's happened is with the Hindhead Tunnel, you now, even at this stage, have a bottleneck at Guildford.
Don't have to tell me. I mean, if I come through the roundabout at Shalford, you can see people, the back up from Guildford, and you spin off the A31 or the A3, just goes round that way. So, I mean, we all understand the problem. It's the question of how do we present a report which gives us sufficient protection that we can actually delay the phasing of some of these major projects if that strategic infrastructure is not yet planned and funded and in place.
Mr. Parrott, can you make a comment? Do you think we need to be more robust in our plan on that issue?
I think we can certainly have another look, Chairman, at this, but we thought very long and hard about how you present that sort of information. I mean, just on the cross-boundary issues particularly, I think certainly we can have another look to make sure that we have captured the fact that if there are infrastructure requirements still to be addressed, that if we do identify if there are potentially those that cross boundaries, because I remember having exactly that situation when we were asked to comment on East Hampshire's local plan or core strategies it was then about trying to make sure we got Waverley's messaging about dealing with cross-boundary infrastructure implications arising from Wysehill Borden, for example. And we're very keen to want to make sure we do address those issues because they are potentially issues that could be picked up under the duty to cooperate if a neighbouring authority feels we haven't adequately addressed or tried to discuss with them some of those cross-boundary issues. But beyond that, I mean, we've progressed with this plan based on the information we have, knowing that there are still issues that need to be resolved. And the message we've had is that we haven't had those sort of showstopper issues identified. There is still a bit of work to go, as we've acknowledged in relation to the A3 and further discussions which impact on us and Guildford in terms of what goes forward through the plan. I have to suggest much more their plan, I think, than ours because of the significance of their growth and where it's located. But nonetheless, we are mixed in with that, if you like, because Highways England want to look at the sort of the cumulative effect of development. We don't have a definitive answer at this point in time. All I can say is that we'll continue to work on that.
Well, Chairman, shouldn't our draft at this stage be reflecting that statement? There is.
You look at that, officers, and see what you think. I think Councillor Band has a point. Mr. Hill, Councillor Hill.
Yes, I think Councillor Band probably covered very much of what I was going to ask, but I did wonder, on a slightly different subject, whether there was any actual industrial sites identified. I mean, it's all very well building lots of houses, but where are people going to work? I know Dunsfold there's space for, I believe, for more. But I mean, what about the people who are going to move to live in Farnham or Cranley, or where are they going to work? So there is it is, the need for additional employment land has been identified, but have we actually got any sites?
There's two things. We do have the site in the sense that Dunsfold would include additional employment, and we have a new employment site we've identified in Farnham as well as the other. There's a major location for doing that. We've obviously also got quite a supply of employment land, and you as members will know very clearly how many times you have existing employment sites that may be run down or derelict or whatever that are coming forward where developers are saying there's no need for these employment sites anymore. So part of the work we've done through the employment land review is to try and understand what we think future needs are going to be for employment space, what we currently have in terms of employment space, what the opportunities are on some of the sites that might come forward, bearing in mind that the government also emphasises, again, this comes back to the agenda relating to housing, that we shouldn't be hanging on to sites that may have been used for employment purposes and maybe don't appear to have any further use for employment unless we've got a very good reason for doing so. So we have to reflect that as well, and I think there is a balance of considerations there. The last thing I would say is that the predictions in terms of future jobs growth through our evidence through the employment land review are not particularly high numbers. So I think overall we feel the balance of protecting important sites, some new sites coming forward, is sufficient for the plan.
Question on Dunsfold with regard to housing numbers. And I thought about this earlier and I suddenly realised that I hadn't brought it up. The application is in and we're ready or getting close to having it brought forward to a planning committee for 1,800 houses. As I have seen it, and perhaps the officers can reassure me that I'm wrong, I thought that the layout that they'd given, including the...
Could I stop you there? It's a planning application which is in process, and I don't think we should debate it.
The only point I was going to make, Madam Chairman, building up the story, was that there is country park areas provided there, which supposedly held. Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. In light of some of the concerns that have been raised by my fellow committee members, I feel beholden to propose a change to the recommendation. Can I just confirm this is an appropriate moment for this? Right. All right. Right, I shall hold my fire. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. No, my mathematics isn't my strongest point, but I do question some of these figures. It says on 18.2 that these strategic sites will deliver 4,450 homes, of which 600 have already received planning permission, which leaves 3,850. You take out 2,600 for Dunsfold Park, that still leaves 1,250. And I fail to see either these strategic plans here where you're going to get 1,200 houses.
You don't have the answer. Would you like to think about it and then contact Councillor Holder directly?
I think we'll have another look at it, Madam Chairman. There have been some changes to the inclusion of sites and some picking up things like planning permissions that have come through or otherwise. So it may be there's just a drafting error there, for which I apologise if there is, but we will certainly check the numbers because we don't want the plan to go forward with numbers that may be incorrect. Clearly.
Thank you to Mr. Holder.
Thank you, Chairman. Very early on in the briefing of members, we were told in relation to traffic issues that we were probably going to have to live with a little bit of incremental congestion, but that one of the key issues that would force people to look long and hard at plans was the issue of safety. Now, we've just completed a strategic highways assessment from Surrey, and you'll excuse me if I haven't had time to digest it properly. It arrived rather lamentably late, but we now have it, and the word safety doesn't appear in it once. So I would like to ask the officers where the safety implications at this strategic site level are actually addressed, particularly as the strategic plan, the bit that I did read, stated that there's going to be a very substantial increase in traffic on minor and back roads, particularly around the Cranley and Dunsfold area, so that covers multiple applications. And those are precisely the places where the worst risk of serious accidents occurs. Witness the fact that we've had 3 fatalities in eastern villages off the main 281 during the last 12 months. So perhaps officers would like to comment. Thank you.
We throughout the process with the strategic assessment, for a start, we have constantly talked to the County Council to get a better understanding of what they may feel constitutes a severe impact and whether that severity of impact is triggered by a particular evidence around safety concerns, because our understanding from those discussions is that that's often where the focus is. And so I know this takes something slightly different, but on the discussions about the A3, for example, I know that Highways England obviously are looking not just about whether there's going to be additional congestion, but particularly whether there are highway safety implications from additional development and how that might affect the road network. So through the discussions we've had with them in terms of the strategic assessment and through some of the work that's been done by McDonald, you'll have seen the reports that have been done for different parts of the borough. Those are issues that have been picked up and addressed, and we, throughout this process, have had to rely on the discussions with our expert colleagues at the County Council particularly about whether they believe the outputs from those bits of work, whether it's the strategic assessment or the more local assessments, identify what they might regard as severe impacts, i.e. impact, and that would be safety as well as other factors. And those are not issues that they've currently raised with us.
And Chairman, just to add to that, of course, something we said earlier, that as these sites come forward, they still need planning permission, still within your gift as planning committee members to assess the sites in detail. And of course, one of those important considerations is, again, highway safety, and any development in its detail would have to satisfy us through the County Highway Authority that the traffic implications are safe and that they can be accommodated within the highway network without undue stress on capacity and safety issues. Chairman.
Thank you. If I can just add to that, the Transport Development Control in Surrey Highways, they do specifically not look at tarmac on roads, they specifically look at safety elements on all the planning applications that come in are of a major nature. And we get an opportunity through our planning committee to actually put our 2 penneth in as well. So there are 2 areas there. You wanted to come back, Mr. Seaborn.
If I may, thank you very much. Yeah, so I mean, the point again is that if that work has been done, why is it not documented in the strategic report that has just come out? I'm sure they have been looking at safety. Well, yes, but it's evidence related to the plan. So the question is, does the evidence related to the plan sustain the conclusions that we're being told about but are not written down in that report? Because, yes, Mott MacDonald did address safety, but the larger strategic plan doesn't mention safety anywhere. So that's point one. And then the second point of planning applications is fine, but we're at the strategic level now where the cumulative impacts of everything that's going on in Oldfold, Dunsfold, Cranley can be assessed. And it always happens when you get down to the individual site level. The impacts are slightly less than the cumulative. So 2 points there.
Any comment, officers?
It's a very specific point and a valid one. I think what we do, we'll take it away and we will discuss it with our colleagues at the County Council as to how that's conveyed through the strategic transport assessment, and perhaps we'll take it up with you offline if that's helpful. Councillor Seaborn, thank you.
Can I just make the point that we're all imagining that all this that's in the plan, which is over a period of 15 years, is going to happen tomorrow and we're going to be gridlocked. It's not going to happen like that. There will be challenges, but, you know, that's the way of the world. And we have those challenges now. So please don't think all this is going to happen tomorrow, because it isn't. It's going to be planned, and that's the whole purpose of the plan, to actually put in what we think we need. Okay, I have missed the next speaker. Mr. Ellis.
Thank you, Chairman. I figure that we're probably perhaps drawing towards a close here. May I at least thank the officers who have obviously worked very, very hard on this piece of work. I think it must be a little frustrating then to having done it, to invite us lot in to criticise it as well and still go away smiling. I hope that what we have contributed is going to be helpful to them, and I have to say I don't, and I doubt whether any other of my colleagues from the eastern part of the borough, I don't regret and I don't apologise for waving the Cranley flag, because I do believe it is important. It is important to us. I believe it is important for Cranley. I believe it is important for Waverley as well. So can I express a very, very deep thank you for all the hard work the officers have done, and can I also, Chairman, express a very big thank you as well. You ran this like it was the Waverley Local Committee, and I knew we weren't going to be here until midnight. Thank you.
I'll just be very brief, Chairman. I mean, I just you know, I think the point that Councillor Seaborn is making is important, because I'm just quoting from a paragraph in the SCC report, which actually says there is a significant amount of further work to do, both for Surrey County Council and Vectus, including auditing of all the other modelling work that may be required. Until this work is completed, a suitable package of highway works cannot be established which safely and sufficiently mitigates the impact of the development. So, I mean, all it goes to show what we've been talking about, you know, there is further work to be done, and making categoric statements that it's a done deal, that we have the answers, it is not appropriate yet. You know, I think we just have to be cautious and make sure we word things appropriately to recognise there is ongoing work that needs to be done.
It is very well taken, thank you. Now, Councillor MacLeod, thank you so much for being so patient. Would you like to come in?
Thank you very much, Chairman. Like Councillor Hess and others, I very much welcome this local plan. And one of my main reasons is I followed the two previous versions of the local plan which failed at the EIP stage. And I feel this local plan has an extremely good chance of succeeding. Mind you, I will say that I predicted that Remain would win last week, so I'm not sure that an endorsement from me counts for very much. But moving on from that, it's extremely important that we have a local plan, otherwise you lose control of your housing planning altogether, and that's what's happened in the past. But even having a local plan isn't sufficient. Although it's essential, it's not sufficient. It's also necessary to have a plan that gives you this famous five-year housing supply. And if we look at the trajectory, I am concerned about this trajectory. The trajectory shows something like 5,000 houses being delivered over the next 5 years, which is actually just about half the number for the whole 19-year plan. And is it realistic to see that happening? Will the developers actually want to do that? Do they want to supply housing at that level? Will it stress the whole system too much? Will it stress Waverley's resources? You've got to actually supervise all this and make sure it's done properly. Does it ensure that the right level of quality is going to happen in the market? So I'm concerned about this trajectory. And actually, I have a question relating to it. It actually demonstrates over-delivery over the next few years. Does the five-year housing supply calculation
therefore allow you to carry forward the excess in the same way as we're currently carrying forward the deficit, which increases and you get penalised by 5% or 20%. If you're on the other side a good deliverer, and it's not us, of course, that are delivering, it's the developers, we're entirely dependent on them, can you carry forward your oversupply, or are you then still expected to supply at the 519 level and therefore finish out having to do even more than you originally planned? So that's my question.
I think there's two comments. Firstly, I think earlier on in the discussion, I did try to explain that what we've done up till now is to ask individual developers when they think they can bring their sites forward. And I do accept that if you look at it, you do raise the question: are they all going to bring all of these sites forward all at the same time? And we're doing some more work on that. We are talking again to the developers. We are going to look again at the trajectory and try and avoid a situation where we're asked the question, is this really realistic? But accepting the fact that we don't have much control over when developers bring sites forward. In answer to the second question, I think no. If we've got a target for our planned period and it just happens that a lot more houses come forward early on in the plan, it's the planned period and the whole number over the planned period we're being expected to deliver. So we wouldn't be penalised because sites came forward earlier than perhaps we expected.
Once, Madam Chairman, if you allow me to, I did note in the next 5 years there's very little from Dunsfold. In fact, it's only 100 in the 5th year from Dunsfold. I just wondered why that was. I would have thought the Dunsfold people would probably want to move at a faster pace than that. And we may need that delivery from Dunsfold if the other people fail to deliver that you referred to.
We've had a number of discussions with Dunsfold developers to get a realistic trajectory from them about what would be delivered, and I think it's fair to say that even by their most optimistic expectations, I don't think they expect to be bringing anything forward within other than perhaps in the sort of fourth of the 5-year period, because of all the work needed to do to get consents in place, and obviously some of the other more complications and infrastructure requirements that might have to go hand in hand with any developments on the site. So I don't think we expect Dunsfold to make a huge contribution in the first 5 years. They think he'll make some if it gets planning permission, but not a huge contribution.
The officers that in fact there's still work to be done. Do you want us to debate those? Because I'm not intending to debate them tonight. I thought we would reconvene, if that's all right with members, on that particular issue. We do have a little bit of time. Can I have comments from the officers?
Chairman, I think we're in members' hands here. If you've got questions now that you think we could cover off briefly, we're very happy to take them. If you would like a further opportunity for us to present the findings more fully to you, and we may even be able to invite a highway colleague along if they're available. That is probably a possible opportunity if they're available. We're in your hands, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Sims. I'd like us to defer the highway one. And I'd like us to invite one of the highway officers from TDC to be present so that we can ask questions relating to the highway papers. I don't want to hear about Dunsfold again, certainly not tonight, and I always thought that Farnham was the centre of the universe, but it now appears to have moved to Cranley. But it's entirely in your hands, ladies and gentlemen. I don't think we can do it tonight, because I think there are some unanswered questions. I think there is benefit in asking a highway officer to be present to answer any questions and to support our officers. Mrs. Forochewski.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I would absolutely endorse that, based on the comments I made earlier about the complexity of the technical merits of the information. So, yes, I would fully support your suggestion.
I think if we could have someone from Mott as well. So we've got the two sides of the coin. Are we all happy with that? And we'll need to meet within the next 7 days. Now, I'm going to put the recommendation, but I gather you want to amend it.
Madam Chairman, thanks very much for letting me come back. I think we can really strengthen the recommendation by adding an explanation of why we are being asked to consider this local plan. And therefore, I would propose a form of wording such or similar to that the Joint Overview and Scrutiny Committee considers the draft local plan part 1 and forwards any comments to the Executive in order to ensure that the local plan meets Waverley's strategic objectives in accordance with accepted quality and management best practice.
Do you have a seconder? I'm trying to understand the amendment, but never mind.
My concern is that otherwise we don't know what the effect of any consideration we may have, have completed will have, and what will flow from it. But by tying it to our strategic objectives, it gives us an absolute headmark to aim for, and by including the wording that this is conducted in accordance with quality and management best practice, it gives us places to go to see what best practice looks like and to assess whether or not we have met those things. I'm assuming, because it's a jolly good plan, that most of that work has already been done, and indeed officers have already confirmed to numerous questions that that is exactly what's been done, but it raises, it exposes that quality of work to a level which can be easily accessed and understood by all and sundry, without the need for people to express concerns and ask repeated questions, and to make this look in any way as if we could just be coming here to rubber stamp something. It is good practice to understand why you conduct an action.
But I think the recommendation we have does actually say that. But it is up to members. Do you have a seconder?
No.
Right. Okay. Speak to the amendment.
I think what Councillor Hess has to say is right. I think we should be absolutely clear this time. We've failed too many times before. If it's a question of you're just thinking you're dotting the I's and crossing the T's, fine, that's okay. But I think it's well worth putting it in. After all, it's not going to take much time to do it, I wouldn't have thought. So yes, I would think it's a good thing to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Lee.
I was just going to say that I support and endorse that particular approach. I think it just gives added resilience, and when you've got added resilience, any reader has confidence, more confidence in the truth and the depth of research that has gone into it. Thank you.
I think that's what members want to amend the recommendation, Chairman. I don't think we've got any objection to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chairman. 1, that's carried.
Abstentions?
2.
It's all too much. I'm losing the will to live. Can I just say a very big thank you to the officers, those who sat through this evening, and for the report. And also we have the portfolio holder here, and I would like to thank him for the work that he has done on this. If you wish to come to the Highways meeting, sir, can you please put your name down to speak? Thank you very much indeed. But thank you all very much indeed for coming. The meeting is closed. It's adjourned. Half the time I don't understand. That's all right. That's all right, you're welcome. Half the time I don't understand what Christian Hess is saying.
Get hung up on words.
He does. He does get hung up on words, and he's got to learn to plain speak.
I was going to try and do it to you, but I thought I didn't have to because I shouldn't bring my fingers. 2-1 to Iceland at the moment.
That's because I'm not watching it. Ladies and gentlemen, the score currently is Iceland 2, England 1.